All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Myers. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the Innovation Working Group here at PNWER. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this webinar on the 4 phases of safe and resilient recovery. This is our initial webinar for the Innovating Our Way Out of the Crisis series. The series of webinars is going to be held in lieu of our annual summit that was supposed to be held this July, but we're going to be postponing that because of COVID until August of 2021 in Big Sky, Montana. So with that, if anybody needs any additional information, please visit our website at www.penwer.org. And then also you can find information about other webinars that we're holding, resources that we have on COVID-19 from around the region, and a couple other items that might be important to you. And then as far as housekeeping today, this webinar is going to be recorded. It's also going to be shared later in the week with everyone. So if you don't get a chance to stay on the whole time, or if you have a colleague that you'd like to have view it, it's available for that as well. With this, I'm going to pass it over to our CEO for the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, Matt Morrison, to make a few remarks. So thanks, Matt.
All right, thanks very much, Steve, and thank you so much for putting this together with the able and wonderful help of Nirav Desai and Senator Costello. PNWER, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, is really been focusing a lot of our 18 working groups on how do we recover safely from this COVID global outbreak. And this, as Steve mentioned, is the first of a series on innovation. We also are looking at a number of other working group webinars coming up, and they are on our website. We will have one with Alex Hergott on looking at permit reform in terms of economic recovery, and that will be on July 15. On July 20, one on energy, how the Western grid will deal with decarbonization and resilience, and that will look at a 20-year view of hydrogen and clean hydrogen in the entire Western grid. And then in July 16, we'll be looking at cybersecurity and the ever-changing role of the cyber information security officer, looking at lessons for leadership in this post-COVID world. And we will then also have a series of webinars on agriculture and food for the future. What are the implications on our food supply of the post-COVID and as we're dealing with COVID? We will also have several on securing the virtual workforce and cybersecurity, and one on the connected worker. What is it going to be like over the next 2 years, looking at the changing ways of the workplace? All of these are focused on how we can look at best practices at member states and provinces and territories are addressing the COVID response and recovery. So with that, I urge you to take a look at the PNWER website and join us for other working group webinars as they come up. But now I'd like to just really thank Nirav Desai, who is an amazing thinker, entrepreneur, investor. He's the Seattle chapter president of the VR, AR, Virtual Reality, Augmented Reality Association, and he has mentored many people and startups through Techstars Seattle, Amazon Alexa Startup Accelerators, the UW or University of Washington CoMotion Labs, and he's the innovation co-chair for PNWER. And we're very fortunate to have him and his leadership. And he works with Senator Costello, who is the chair of the Labor and Commerce Committee in Alaska. She is also on the Judicial Committee, the Regulatory Review Committee. She is a pilot and Olympic swimmer. And when her She just got a broken leg, but we're hoping that she'll quickly be healed. She has an illustrious career, not only in the legislature, but prior to that, she was Deputy Director of Communications for Governor Frank Murkowski and also worked for Governor Wally Hickel. And she's a teacher. She has a degree at Harvard and at the University of Alaska, and has just really been the perfect person to lead our innovation work group with Nirav. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Nirav. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Steve and Margaret. Thank you for being here. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, Nirav, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Actually, I'll hand it over to Mia. She's going to introduce Margaret, who's our guest on this webinar.
Great, thanks, Nirav. Thanks, Matt, for reviewing many of the programs that PNWER offers. I mean, they're all so valuable and they just really sound very interesting. And so I encourage everyone who's listening in now to actually participate in those too. So with that, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Margaret O'Mara. She's the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. She's also a contributing writer for the New York Times. She writes and teaches about the growth of the high-tech economy, history of US politics, and the connections between the two. She's also an author, having authored several books. Her most recent one, which I highly encourage everyone to read, is called The Code: Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. She's been currently on a book tour promoting that writing of hers, and it's really quite groundbreaking. Thank you for providing that to the community, Margaret.
Thanks.
She's also been a contributor to the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Bloomberg Business Week, Foreign Policy, the American Prospect, and the Pacific Standard. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and her Bachelor of Arts from Northwestern. And prior to her academic career, she worked in the Clinton White House and also was a contributing researcher at the Brookings Institution. And so we are really pleased to have you here. You're such an asset and quite a source of wealth of information for us. So thank you, Margaret, for joining us today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Nirav. Nirav and I recently authored an article talking about the 4 phases of recovery, and Nirav is going to start off today's discussion by reviewing those phases, and then we will be focusing on several of those in our questions. Nirav?
Thanks, Mia. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I want to really hand it over to Margaret for her insight. But as we're starting this talk, recently in the Anchorage Daily News, we published an op-ed around the 4 phases of recovery, and these phases are not really distinct. They're going to kind of bleed into each other. But in order to kind of bound this conversation, I thought I'd quickly run through this. And the bulk of the conversation will really be around phase 3 and 4. But you know, first thing is making sure that the health security of the region is sound. And we're kind of in a phase right now where we're progressing from phase 1 to phase 2. Phase 2, of course, is economic restoration. In order to stop the spread of the virus, the entire world shut down for about 3 months. We're now at the point where we're starting to reopen. This introduces new risk, the potential of a resurgence, but it also, we're working through how to reopen safely. Once we get businesses open again, there's some fundamental shifts in the economy that have taken place, and we will have to retool the economy based on the new normal, the new work conditions. And so PNWER is thinking through what that actually means, how to analyze gaps, inventory the assets that we have in the region. And we're talking through this idea of a resilience foundry. How can we challenge industry to plan for resilience? And then fourth, of course, is that what will that new normal be? The way we've done business in the past will not come back completely. There will be some systematic changes that influence the core of the economy. And we don't really know what those are yet. So part of the conversation here is to think through, one, retooling, and two, what will the new normal be, and what can historical narrative teach us, and where are we going? So with that, Margaret, I'd love to get your thoughts both on these phases, but also what history teaches us around past crises.
Yeah. Well, thanks, and thanks for having me. There, we use a lot of different verbs to think about when you're in a moment of crisis, about restoring the economy, which is very important, rebuilding what we had, getting back to where things were before. But what crisis functions, and what we do know from the past, is that hitting the reset button, crisis kind of hits is an opportunity to take a pause. We literally had an economic pause, one that is historically unprecedented. We've had other comparable, we've had pandemics before, we've had economic crises before, but we haven't had something that's quite the way that it is right now. And hitting the reset button provides an opportunity to rebuild, but also build differently. And thinking, and what we also know from historical examples is that it doesn't have to be just because you're in a moment of economic crisis, including public sector scarcity, because this is a crisis that is already having its impact on state and local budgets, for example. That does not mean that you can't rebuild creatively. And I think the lessons learned, we have a number of instances, and I'm going to sort of bring some out from the last 100 years of U.S. history as I think compelling examples of where public-private investment was something that addressed near-term economic needs, and then turned out had a very long economic tail. And I think that should be perhaps a guiding principle in thinking about what's possible now. So take, for example, the 1930s. That was another global economic crisis, the Great Depression. There's an economic crisis on the scale and the scope that we have not approached until now. And this was a time when there was a real reinvention of the government, the federal government's role in American life, one that was not without its political controversies. Franklin Roosevelt often what's sometimes forgotten is how many critics Roosevelt had in his lifetime of his approach, the New Deal, of using government spending to reinvigorate the economy. But what did happen were a whole host of programs that were designed to put people back to work that actually had the net effect of having a long tail. And we see this in the Pacific Northwest with the infrastructure that was built around hydroelectric power, all the dams on the Northwest River, the Cooley, the Columbia, all these great dam projects. Now, they are not without their complications and their trade-offs and the ancillary environmental and cultural damage that was created by damming these rivers. We shouldn't overlook that. But it's a really interesting example of, here's a massive infrastructure project that was made possible by the political momentum around, that was suddenly given for the government to do something to revitalize the economy, because unemployment was so high, and because economic conditions were so desperate, both in rural, inland Pacific Northwest, as well as the cities along the coast. And the dam projects were designed actually to irrigate the dry, the arid agricultural West. It was the Grand Coulee, for example, was something that was presented to the Roosevelt administration by a group of business leaders and agricultural leaders from Central Washington, who said we need to revitalize the economy here with damming the rivers and creating an irrigation system. Well, it turns out that building this dam put hundreds, if not thousands, of people to work, so it had a near-term economic effect. And then the long tail was not just agricultural and didn't just affect Central Washington, but also provided cheap hydroelectric power for Western Washington, which turns out you need to have a lot of electric power to build aluminum airplanes, right? So it was something that helped fuel the industrialization and particularly the growth of the aerospace industry in Western Washington in successive decades. So there's an example of a long tail of something that at the time lawmakers probably weren't thinking about it, but it had a long tail. We see this again and again in instances in 20th century American history. We see this with the GI Bill, 1944. The GI Bill comes into existence because there was great concern about all these servicemen are coming back from war, and they aren't going to have jobs waiting for them. There was an economic depression when they left. They don't have education. They don't have the means to, buy a home. How can the government help veterans do that? And so the GI Bill sets in motion all these programs that it contributes to the spike in home ownership and wealth creation among veterans, college education and wealth creation and upward mobility, and the growth of higher education. And it continues to have a long tail to this day. Again, created for very immediate problems, for immediate policy issue that's facing America at a time of some economic scarcity, but yet the decision is made to invest for the long term. So I think we see a lot of examples of targeted public-private investments that can have a long tail, and I think that's the way, and to take advantage of crisis, for lack of a better term, and to open up the possibilities. Here are the things we've wanted to do for a long time, and there hasn't been space to do them, and how can we really do this in a way that addresses some of the problems we identified in the economy before this crisis, and how do we make it better?
Thank you, Margaret. Did you want to talk a little bit more about the conditions and factors that led from the transformation of Silicon Valley from farmland, and then also from Seattle, from timberland to a high-tech hub?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I've been studying the history of Silicon Valley and other high-tech regions for a long time, since the dot-com era, and it's been a really fascinating. I think it's a great example of how this very modern high-tech story, this story of entrepreneurialism and business success, actually has its roots in some of those moments I was just talking about. So Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley, it was just known as the Santa Clara Valley. It was another agricultural valley in California. And its real turning point was World War II. World War II brings, as we know in the Pacific Northwest, a great deal of military spending flows west because of the Pacific Theater. There's extensive military installations, and this includes in the valley in the San Francisco Peninsula, there was the presence of the military. There was also Stanford University, which I don't know how many Stanford alumni are on this call, but I know there are plenty of other Pac-12 alums who will be happy to know that Stanford wasn't all that before the 1950s. It was a good university, but it was really wanting to be a lot better. And what Stanford did is it built up, it kind of recognized that a lot of money was going to start flowing from Washington, D.C., not just general issue military spending, but that the U.S. government from the 1940s and then into the Cold War started doing something it hadn't done before, which was spending a lot of money on science and technology. This was when the National Science Foundation, these major funding agencies, first came into being. And the needs of the Cold War military-industrial complex were not just to build up military power in the US generally, but also had a very specific focus on building up capacity in electronics, microelectronics, and communication, radar, transistorized communication, all of these things that would enable rockets and missiles to go a long way. All of those technologies were very salient to fostering the kind of creating a funding streams for the building blocks of the high-tech revolution to come. And Silicon Valley was interesting in that it already had a very small but a distinct specialization in building small electronics and communication devices. And this is something that Stanford really doubled down on. It built up programs that were focused on that. Silicon Valley was also, the silicon came into Silicon Valley in the 1950s, also because of one of the co-inventors of the transistor, who was originally from Palo Alto, a guy named William Shockley, decided to come home and start the Valley's first high-tech startup, really, or the first, silicon semiconductor startup that really becomes kind of the great-grandfather of all these other startups to come. So you have this really different moment in American history when the federal government is effectively functioning as a giant venture capitalist. It's providing all of this seed capital, it's providing all this research money, it's flowing to universities, it's flowing to private industry, and it's becoming a major customer for these very high-tech products that don't yet have a market. We've seen some similar things in Seattle. This was also a defense hub. You had Boeing, which is then and now has a major defense business as well as a commercial business. And the presence of what this functions as is it brings all these educated workers in. It builds up higher education institutions that are in the place to train people in these specialized industries. And once clusters start, as many people who are in the economic development business on the call know, there's kind of a snowball effect. You get agglomeration effects. You get more and more specialized companies coming, close to one another, that in turn help specialized clusters of industries develop that are very much rooted in the attributes of a particular place.
So Margaret, there were two interesting points that kind of stuck out there. One is the infrastructure point about the Grand Coulee Dam.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're going through that, I couldn't help but think about, not only was it how, initially thought about for irrigation for farm, but then it became power generation. Then it, even now, you think of it as the cheap electricity for server farms. And we're in the progress of moving into blockchain and Bitcoin technology, being powered by hydropower. So it's not, if the infrastructure successively reinvents itself, or the applications of it, is
That's
that
right.
a trend
That's right.
that you see elsewhere? And the other point, really, is Manhattan Project, created Hanford, brought a lot of spending across the country. Post-war, Cold War research dollars spent on the space program, the military industrial complex. That narrative going into establishing innovation hubs throughout the country. What role did local governments play in kind of channeling that, in terms of that money coming in from the federal government? But was it just Palo Alto or Stanford doubling down on their research, or was there cooperation with state and local governments as well? Can you speak to that?
That's a really great question. And I think those two, there's sort of two questions bundled in here that I think are connected. One is this general, the success of the multiple lives and afterlives of a piece of infrastructure, a piece of public policy, which of course were not intended. When we think about Silicon Valley, the electronics industry that blossomed there, that then in the 50s, that then goes on to become the valley we know. It's not like Ike Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office and said, I shall build a science city and it shall be in Palo Alto. Like there was not, and this is really frustrating from a policy planning perspective, because so much of this stuff is serendipity and, goofy, right time, right place, who knew? But I think that's really instructive right now at this moment of intense uncertainty, when we're like, we don't know what's going to happen. Like, what's going to happen 3 months from now? What's going to happen 3 years from now? We don't know. We've never had certainty. I mean, history, that's one thing history shows you. There's never, it's why historians don't like making predictions, because we're like, we've seen other people make predictions and they're usually wrong, because we're always in a state of uncertainty, which shouldn't disempower us from having long-term thinking and understand that what the choices made now can have a really long-term positive effect. And I think local government, I think it depends on the place. In the case of Silicon Valley, actually one of the things that enabled the tech industry to grow there with so little friction is that it was just an agricultural area with some small towns and some growing, commuter suburbs. But it wasn't a city. And in a way, Stanford was kind of the biggest player in town and was a great big landowner as well. Stanford's very unusual in that it owns nearly 9,000 acres of land, and it's developed that land. Part of that land is the Stanford Shopping Mall, if anyone's familiar with Palo Alto. Some of it's subdivisions, but some of it is the Stanford Research Park, which is where Hewlett Packard is headquartered, where a whole host of other companies have been headquartered over the years. So they had a lot of, they were kind of a city government, a local government of their own in some ways, and they were a developer of their own. So I think in the case of Seattle, you see another place or the Seattle region, you see, incidents where local leaders, both elected and sort of civic leaders, business leaders, have acted proactively or attempted to. The case of, in the 1950s, of Seattle Metro, which cleaned up, among other things, cleaned up Lake Washington, which was very much a really very important turning point in the region's history, where you had an incredibly polluted lake that had been, suffering the consequences of rapid urban and suburban development, and there was a kind of a civic consensus that that was something that was not sustainable on many metrics. So I think there's a lot that I think, the story, what we see in all of these cases is sort of opportunity flows in the direction of the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, and individuals, leaders of institutions like the deans and provosts of Stanford, or local elected and state elected officials seize that opportunity. And we also see a real role for state governments too. I think the state of California is a big player in understanding why Silicon Valley is where it is and how it grows the way it does, and how different governors over the years have worked to create conditions that encourage the growth of high-tech industry. Particularly Jerry Brown, in his first term as governor in the 70s and the early 80s, was very, very much kind of eager to help grow the tech industry. And so I think there's certainly a role for government. It's kind of taking advantage and being proactive about the opportunity that comes your way.
Well, that's actually a good turn to me. I wouldn't mind talking to you a little bit about Alaska with that great segue. There's kind of 4 pillars, as I understand, of the Alaska economy: oil and gas, defense, tourism, and fishing. Right now, with what's going on, 3 of those legs are suffering. Oil prices are low. Restaurants are not ordering as much fish, and tourism has all but shut down. What is Alaska thinking about diversification? What are their thoughts around diversification and innovating their way out?
Well, thanks, Narev. Here in Alaska, we've always been challenged by trying to diversify our economy. We actually have 3 main legs of our stool, and mainly oil and gas industry, the military investment, and then everything else. So fishing, timber, mining creates a 3-legged stool, which is a little bit unnerving, of course. But one of the things that we pride ourselves on, and I think a lot of us do in the Pacific Northwest, is that Alaskans are innovators at heart. And historically, you look at the 1925 sled dog trip to Nome, where there were 150 sled dog teams, and we were responding to a medical crisis at that time with diphtheria, and there was no way to reach the citizens of this community. And so Alaskans came together, and we still to this day commemorate that enormous effort to help our other Alaskans with their health crisis by having a race that is called the Iditarod, and it happens every year. I think that with everything in what we face in government and society, that there are certain opportunities, and they are usually based on what I would call a tent pole, which is something that exists there already that you can build upon and grow upon that. And one of the things that's very exciting is the Alaska's Unmanned Aircraft Systems program, and we recently had the first beyond visual line of sight drone flight in the country here in Alaska, flew along the pipeline. And so there's tremendous opportunity for potential cargo drones, and Alaska's very remote. We have the country's largest aviation system with over 237 rural airports. And so our citizens who live here, many of them are remote and removed from major centers of population. And so getting medical supplies or getting things to those communities is something that we've been dealing with for quite some time. Oftentimes, if you're looking at something being sent to you, you have to wait for a barge to come or an airplane to fly in. Many of the airports are too small for larger aircraft. And so I think the unmanned aircraft opportunity is really one that would serve us well. And of course, as Margaret mentioned, you can't necessarily force these things or create them, but they're sort of an organic coming together of the assets that you already have. And so I'm really excited about that. You know, another thing I wanted to mention is the Alaska Center for Energy and Power and the U.S. Arctic Research Commission recently had a seminar with 170 participants from 8 countries on electric vehicles, and Tesla was a part of that. We talked about strategies to improve cold weather operability. You know, and this type of forward thinking and bringing together people from across the world who are faced with these cold climates, I think is another opportunity. And then finally, and Rev, you and I talked about this, as we look at what the consumer is going to be asking for in the future, I think a lot of it will be technological, you know, devices and things. And we do have rare earth elements here in Alaska in our mining community. And what we're hoping to do is move more into an onshoring, you know, situation where we're manufacturing more in our country versus sending it out. And with the advances in technology that have less of a footprint on our, you know, on our Earth, I think that there are some exciting possibilities there. We do have a university system in Alaska and a lot of research going on related to the Arctic, and we have a lot of young entrepreneurs who are looking at ways that we can address some of these consumer-driven issues and provide, you know, what people are going to be looking for. And of course, government, you know, has a role too, as Margaret said. And so we're all working together, you know, to try to address that.
So that's really interesting. 2 points that stuck out with me. One is the I was surprised to learn that Anchorage is the second largest cargo airport in the country. And there's such a natural logistics play when you talk about aviation in Anchorage, because it's what equidistant between Europe, Asia, and lower 48. Unmanned cargo, it was something that the report that PNWER and University of Washington did last year kind of identified as a key focus area. And it's good to see that that's something that the state's looking at. But then the other is, you know, the crisis has uncovered a number of supply chain dependencies on the global supply chain, and rare earth minerals is one of them, right? There's very little rare earth processing in the U.S. done right now, and it's great to hear that Alaska is looking into that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some exciting opportunities. I mean, obviously there are some challenges, but as we all know, that there are also opportunities out there. So I think we wanted to move into phase 3, Narev, and maybe ask Margaret a question about how can we learn from some of the major historical events and other world-changing events? For example, the Cold War and 9/11 and what we're experiencing now, and take invention and innovation seriously as we move through these phases. Margaret, how would you approach that? You know, what suggestions do you have for the private sector, for government, for individuals as we move into this new phase of our existence here?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a role. You know, the secret of American tech isn't just free market entrepreneurship and you know, companies doing it all their own. It also isn't just big government. It isn't just, you know, it isn't just about the military industrial complex. It's actually a combination of the two, which I think is this really great, important, distinctive North American story that is very instructive for right now. There is a really important role that government has as a seed investor and as an investor in technologies that don't yet have a market, and creating incentives for private sector actors, for researchers, for academic institutions to push the needle on innovation. the analogy I like to use about what's happened, what I see in the story of Silicon Valley and Seattle and other high-tech regions is that the US government and other governments kind of created this great sandbox where you have, the wooden container and then puts the sand in, and then allows inventors, entrepreneurs, thinkers, creatives to come in and build sandcastles and throw sand at each other and collaborate and do whatever, but created an immense amount of flexibility for entrepreneurial energy to express itself and for people to build great companies and take things to market. So creating that sandbox is sort of, I think there's a really just sort of important role for government, and it needs to be appreciated, and it's different than the role the private sector plays. There's things that only government can and should do, and there's things that private sector shouldn't be expected to do in terms of basic research and kind of fueling the next kind of proverbial moonshot. They can do some of that, and industrial research has been a big engine of innovation historically. But in terms of the scale of what governments can invest, and also the fact that governments represent the people, right? It's supposed to represent the public good. They have an accountability, a broader based social accountability that a company like Google or Microsoft, no matter how much of a heap of cash they might be sitting on, they don't have. They have different, they aren't accountable to the public in the way that a state legislature or a governor or a president might be. And that's a really important distinction to have. I think the other principle to keep in mind is recognizing, I think when you were talking about what you're doing in Alaska is a great example of building on core competencies and strengths and recognizing what is a region or a sub-region really good at, what's already there, and building on it rather than saying, oh, they're building silicon semiconductors over there, we're going to build them over here, when you don't have existing capacity that logically feeds into that. And we have a lot of places around the world that have called themselves Silicon something that aren't Silicon Valley, right? And so building on core competencies and targeting resources, recognizing you can't be all things to all people. Fred Terman, who was the Dean of Engineering and then the Provost at Stanford, who's really the chief driver behind the reorganization of Stanford in the 50s that made it Stanford. He called it steeples of excellence, which was building up certain programs like physics and then specialized things like microwave technology, not the ovens, but the actual microwaves themselves. And when you do that, you can't have a full-fledged public policy school. They left that to Berkeley. There were other programs that shrunk. Now, I'm not saying that that's a really great model for every university, particularly public universities, to follow. I think there's needs to be much broader based liberal education, broadly defined, that needs to happen in public institutions. But I think it's useful when we think about, from an economic development strategy, what are the things that the Pacific Northwest really has a competitive edge at, where there's an ability to double down and really become, the place for advanced technology X, and build on the existing capacity and make that something that is an engine of economic growth that then has wider effects.
Thank you for that. So one of the questions that Nirav and I had put together along with PNWER was something related to efficiency versus redundancy. And so the crisis identified huge gaps and dependencies built into supply chains, from PPE manufacture to agricultural goods processing. Have we over-globalized, and how do we adjust the balance of the benefits of globalization with the resilience of localization, which was something you mentioned, in terms of what regions can, offer specifically. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I've been thinking about that a lot. And if it were an easy problem to unravel, right, we would have unraveled it. I think part of this is a consequence of we've created incredibly efficient and lean supply chains, both in the private sector and in government. And there's been a real push particularly in the US in the last 40 years, for leaner, more efficient government more like a business. And that has eliminated a lot of inefficiencies in it. It's had a positive effect, but it also has, I think, over-indexed for those efficiencies and kind of held government to a standard where, there needs to be a bit of redundancy, like you need to have your ventilator stockpiles, things that actually don't pencil out from a business perspective or things that government should do. I think the real challenge, we coupled this incredibly lean, globalized supply chain that's also been coupled with policies, national and supranational policies that have that certainly in the last 10 years have tilted towards nationalism rather than global cooperation. And the real challenge about COVID-19 is that this is a global pandemic. The solution is going to come globally. A country could stamp out the pandemic within its borders, but as soon as it opens up its international airport, I mean, New Zealand now has a few cases imported from Britain, so there are these realities that, regardless of how one feels about the upsides or downsides of economic globalization, this is the reality, and it's going to demand supranational solutions. What does that mean on the local level? I mean, I think it does mean, this is a reminder of how having an incredibly lean, just-in-time supply chain has not served. It does not serve a crisis well. And we even find companies like Amazon, which is has had the most, effective expression of that just-in-time supply chain, has even in the crisis has found that, oh my gosh, the magnitude of what we're being asked to do, we cannot match that. So it's, again, this is a time of reckoning, I think, both for the public and the private sector. Not necessarily to like put up the walls and bring everything from offshore to onshore. That's, the horse is out of the barn. Like, we have a global economy, but it's recognizing, again, the public sector, kind of the value of the value of bureaucracy, and by speaking of like nonpartisan expert bureaucracies, and having government capacity to kind of create that safety net in many, many different senses of the word, public health, economic, that is allowing a agile entrepreneurial economy to continue to function, but you have this backstop that's provided, that's serving the public good.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pivot to Narev and see if you wanted to provide some comments, Narev, about the efficiency versus redundancy.
Yeah, so sorry, that made me think a little bit about, as you were talking, Amazon had a really, when Amazon created Amazon Web Services, right? The idea and one of the big selling points of going to Amazon Web Services was the idea of ability to scale quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I'm running my own server farm in my own corporation, and I start trending, my servers I don't have the capability to scale with the demand. With cloud computing, that's possible, right? So that was a creation kind of partially inspired by the intelligence community, partially commercialized or largely commercialized by Amazon. But it's a challenge that society faced. And when you go to the backstory of big data, it really was a public-private collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at some of the challenges that we're having, medical capacity, we got to run towards efficiency for hospitals to continue to operate. At the same point, when we have a crisis, we need to have excess bed capacity. Is this something? I mean, it makes me think, and I don't have an answer for this, but I'm thinking about those are the types of challenges I think the government can articulate and challenge industry to address.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that the SBIR program invites industry to help solve challenges in ongoing space. It's an interesting concept, and I wonder if there's historical parallels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, the historical parallel, I think that the Cold War as a whole, it certainly in the US context provides a pretty robust example of public-private cooperation and look, the defense industry, the defense business was, I mean, this is, nothing like geopolitical threat to get the faucets running in terms of public spending. And look, we're a geopolitical threat right now. I would love for, I think a great grand challenge for the United States to aspire to would be thinking about how can we kind of engage in a similarly massive investment in both the present and the future that's public and private, that doesn't have to do with building nuclear warheads,
Right.
but that is something like around green energy, or something that again has a geopolitical impact, has a big economic impact in terms of have a massive impact on economies like Alaska's that are oil and gas dependent, for example. And how do you, you're going to really need a public-private investment. I think one of the challenges about sort of both telling the story and really reckoning with kind of what is the right role of government, and also to help business, particularly the tech business, understand that, think about government entities as partners rather than adversaries or regulators, is to, in the American case, that the role of government has often been submerged. It's been hidden. Look, the military industrial complex in the United States grew in the 1950s. What else is going on in the 1950s? It's the McCarthy era. It's we're all engaged in this global struggle with the Soviet Socialist Union, Soviet Union. The last thing that the Eisenhower administration is going to be doing is overseeing this massive growth in big government agencies. And so effectively the government grows in a decentralized, privatized manner. It gives contracts to private sector companies like Lockheed and Boeing. It gives grants and contracts to universities, public and private, from Alaska to Washington to Stanford to MIT. And that is the way that this money flows. And because it flows indirectly, it often flows in ways that the people who are beneficiaries of it don't quite understand how much the government is part of. And I think that's part of the entrepreneurial magic, quite frankly. When you had more command and control systems in other countries, there was less entrepreneurial activity. There was less of a startup nation. So that's, there's a tricky mix. But I think just at first kind of baseline recognizing that there is this symbiotic relationship that's always been there, and that companies like Amazon, then and now have Amazon's a very major, important defense contractor, with or without the JEDI contract that it's currently warring over with Microsoft. But cloud computing is now an incredibly critical tool for the defense community, for example, and the intelligence community. And so sort of really just being realistic about that and thinking about, okay, how do we really leverage that for, again, the greater good? And what are the grand challenges that we as a society want to see solved? And how can we work together to do that?
You had a great example in your book, in the code, about Apple's rise and the role of government contracts in the early days of Apple. I think that's more of a plug of your book, but
thank you.
yeah, I think I completely get what you're saying.
Yeah,
Steve,
and
sorry,
actually,
real quick, there were a few people asking to see that phase slide again, so if you could potentially make that available. Sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
Well, I think the Apple case is a really great one of showing that the government story isn't just about defense. It extends beyond that. Early on, and I've talked to a number of people who are longtime Apple people, like, the government had nothing to do with our success. I'm like, well, there's one, the components of the hardware that all of Apple and all these other companies make have their, these origins in this Cold War moment. But I think more broadly, one of Apple's early successes with the Mac, well, the Apple II and then the Mac, was getting it in public schools, getting it in schools. And Steve Jobs, actually, a little known story is that in 1982, Steve Jobs went to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for 2 straight weeks to lobby for a tax break for computers in schools that would effectively kind of make it a lot easier for school districts to buy Apples. He didn't get it. He left discouraged, feeling like Washington, D.C. was worthless. Anyone who's a legislator knows that 2 weeks of lobbying on Capitol Hill is not necessarily going to be, not getting what you want then is not necessarily a failure. But he does successfully persuade Jerry Brown, who was then governor, to do a similar tax break in the state of California. And so Apple becomes, it's one of the reasons that Apple becomes the predominant, for kids of my Gen X generation, that the Apple II was often a Macintosh later was the first computer you touched, and you touched it in your school's computer lab. And as we know, the first computer you touch can often be the one that then you go buy when you're in college and you use after as an adult. So it was a great market boon. And I think there's also a story of, how the larger landscape of, the electronics industry, the computer industry, the venture capital industry have been very effective lobbyists, starting from the 70s forwards, for targeted capital gains tax cuts and for targeted tax cuts that benefit the sort of distinctive industry that is tech. And also very, very successful in lobbying for, very lightly or not regulating the early internet industry, which is one of the reasons we kind of get what we get right now. It's one of the reasons that the industry is not very regulated today, even though it's quite different.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Before we go with our final question, I had to mention that your comment about, we need to be working together, and that's what's so great about PNWER is that it's both government and private sector coming together and really addressing problems together, because we do play very different roles. And so I just think that working with NREV and the Innovation Committee through PNWER has been quite valuable. And there are, as Steve and Matt both mentioned, there are resources online for everyone who wants to look at those and future seminars. So I did want to mention that. Coming from the government standpoint, I think it's really vital and important that we are speaking to everybody and not just isolating ourselves. And so really appreciate this opportunity. So with that, we have a very big question to finally wrap this up. And we'd like, NREV, if you could take this first, and then Margaret, what industries and technologies do you think will be the biggest winners, and which ones will have the biggest challenges as we come out of this worldwide pandemic and in the future economy? So in our future economy, what are your projections in terms of who you see as being, coming out quite well, and then maybe others that are going to be a little more challenged?
Yeah, also, I'm happy to take this first. I think I'll start with the challenges, and I think we are seeing a change in the economy where this whole commercial real estate, people going into the office downtown and working there daily. I think more managers are starting to realize that you don't need to have all your people there together, and that's likely to continue. I think it's going to present significant challenges to commercial real estate and a lot of our urban core. So that's something we should start thinking about. But I think some of the winners here are on the same kind of flip side of the same argument. So remote collaboration has grown tremendously, and people get what it's good for and what it's not good for. It enables more productivity than we all realized. It also presents challenges around getting new work done, so creating new opportunities. You kind of still need that face-to-face collaboration for more creative thought. And then autonomy. Autonomy is going to rise, if nothing else, for business resilience. That includes cargo delivery, but that also includes more robotic process automation and labor-saving technologies. I think the question we'll have to think about is how do we save labor, increase productivity without displacing workers.
Thank you for that. And Margaret?
I'm gonna do a hard agree on NREV's analysis, and also build on it. I'd like to sort of answer that in a different way and think about what places are going to be winners and losers, although we hate to put it that way, but that is the way the economic development game goes, right? You have certain places that growth is uneven, prosperity is uneven. I think one shared goal I would imagine across regions like this is to think about how you make prosperity less geographically uneven, how you create prosperity in places that have not, where it has not been concentrated and that have been missed out on this sort of new innovation economy. But I think, I look to the hallmarks of what kind of throughout human history, where innovation has grown in certain places, why it grows in certain places. And there are kind of three common characteristics. One is you have to have a presence of resources, meaning money, capital. They have to have solved for the basic economic needs and have some people in the community that have wealth, or people or institutions, whether it be a Cold War government or whether it be a philanthropist or whatever it might be, is you need to have some capitals. The second thing you need to have is institutions. That means higher education institutions, research institutions, places that both train next generation workforce and are a magnet for talent, and again, create that sandbox where people can play around and innovate. And the third thing, and I think this is super relevant, thinking about the new geography of remote work and this new flexibility that is going to be, that so many white collar workers are going to have, is quality of place. What is something that draws people in and makes them come there? You know, there's a reason that places like Seattle and Vancouver are, you know, are hubs. There are a lot of people who live in those cities, not just because, oh, I came here for a job or I came here for university, but they wanted to be in the place. There's a quality of place. And now we're going to see, you know, smaller cities, towns, rural areas that have that quality of place. And it isn't just, oh, you can go skiing. It's not just, that's one dimension, but it's also, is it livable? Is it affordable? Is it a place that you could raise a family, buy a home? There are a heck of a lot of people in the major metros of the Pacific Northwest who are itching to go someplace where they can buy a family home for an affordable amount of money and send their kids to public school and live in a community, or maybe live closer to family. And now they're, you know, they might have moved to you know, Palo Alto or Menlo Park because they got a job at Facebook. Now they can work anywhere and work for Facebook. They can move back home to Boise. They can, so that's going to be a real game changer. And I think the Pacific Northwest region has potential to be a winner in that equation because of what's already here. And if there's a commitment to invest and grow what's already here and make the sort of resources, institutions, quality of place continue to be very strong.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate all of your insights and comments into Rev. And somebody commented while you were speaking that PNWER should be an organization that, you know, helps connect the people and the innovators. And so I agree with that. And so with that, I will hand it back to Matt Morrison for some final comments. And again, just want to say thank you everyone for participating. This has been recorded and you can go on to the PNWER website to see a copy of it. So Matt? And if Matt's not available, I'm going to invite Steve to do some wrap up.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yep.
thanks, Steve.
Oh yeah, no, well, thanks again, everybody, for being able to speak to this important topic. We appreciate all the insights that you brought to the table, Margaret, and then all the support that we've gotten from our innovation co-chairs. You know, we are going to have a series of these webinars, and so one thing I did want to mention is that I know in the comments there's a lot of questions about telecollaboration and working remotely, and that's one of the upcoming topics that we're going to be exploring. So you know, if folks have ideas on that, you know, feel free to share those with us. You can reach out to me via my email, and I'm happy to pass it along. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers today. I also like to thank all the PNWER sponsors that have been involved with the organization throughout the years, and also ongoing into the next summit here in August. So with that, I guess I'll close it out with that, and I'm glad everybody was able to join us today.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.